In the early 1980s, the city of Boston looked at the ugly, rusting highway strangling its downtown and made itself a promise. They would tear it down, bury it underground, and stitch the city back together. The plan would cost, they said, around $2.5 billion, and it would be finished by the end of the 1990s.
Thank you all for joining us here today for the announcement of a very, very important decision. A decision with ramifications that will be felt well into the next century.
It was finished nearly a decade late, and by the time the final bill is truly paid off, decades from now, it will have cost the public somewhere in the region of $24 billion, almost 10 times the original promise. It became the single most expensive highway project in the history of the United States, a byword for waste so famous that its nickname is still used as a punchline whenever a public project spirals out of control. But this is not just a story about a big number. Because unlike a fraud or a scam, this project actually got built. The tunnels are real. The traffic really does flow through them today. In many ways, it worked, and yet it is still remembered as one of the great cautionary tales of modern engineering. Why? Because of what it cost to get there. Not just in dollars, but in years, in broken trust, and in one terrible moment, in a human life. So how does a city spend 10 times its budget on a road and end up with something that both succeeded and became a symbol of failure? Stay with me, because the Big Dig is the perfect anatomy of how these disasters really happen.
This is Boston's Big Dig.
To put that final figure in perspective,
The Big Dig, it was this Herculean effort to tear down an elevated highway in the middle of downtown Boston, this dense, crusty old city, and replace that elevated highway with it.
consider what else that money could have built. For what the Big Dig ultimately cost, you could have funded the Hubble Space Telescope several times over. It cost more than the tunnel under the sea that connects Britain and France. More than the development of the largest passenger aircraft ever built. This was a single road, buried beneath a single city, and it consumed a sum that rivals humanity's greatest scientific and engineering achievements. That is the scale we are talking about. Here is the thing you have to understand before any of the money makes sense. This is not a story about a stupid idea. The idea, in fact, was rather brilliant, and the problem it set out to solve was very real. This is a story about how even a good plan, run through years of delays, compromises, and corner cutting, can transform into something monstrous. And it begins with a genuine urban nightmare. For decades, the heart of Boston had been cut in two by an elevated highway called the Central Artery. When it opened in the 1950s, it was meant to be a modern marvel. Instead, it became a scar. This green, rusting, 6-lane road ran on stilts straight through the middle of downtown, casting the streets below into shadow, walling the city off from its own waterfront, and roaring with noise. And worst of all, it was catastrophically congested. Built to carry perhaps 75,000 cars a day, it was, by the 1990s, choking on nearly 200,000. It was jammed for hours on end, with an accident rate several times the national average. So the city dreamed big. What if you could take that ugly, elevated highway and put the whole thing underground? Replace the eyesore on stilts with a wide, modern tunnel buried beneath the city. Tear down the old road and turn the space it left behind into parks and open streets, reconnecting Boston to its harbor after half a century. And while you are at it, build a whole new tunnel under the harbor itself.
Great idea. Sounds beautiful. It ended up being extremely complicated, extremely expensive.
To link the city directly to its airport. And on paper, it was glorious. It was ambitious, visionary, exactly the kind of bold thinking a great city should aspire to. The plans were drawn up, the funding was fought for, and in 1991, after years of political struggle, the digging finally began. Boston was going to perform a miracle of engineering right under its own feet. But that phrase, under its own feet, was the whole problem. Because this was where the dream collided with reality. Here is the challenge they had actually taken on, and it is almost dizzying when you grasp it. They were not building a highway across an empty field. They were digging an enormous tunnel directly underneath a city that had to keep functioning the entire time. The old elevated highway above still had to carry its 200,000 cars a day while they dug beneath it. Somebody described it, memorably, as trying to perform open-heart surgery on a patient, while that patient is wide awake and running a marathon. And beneath the streets of a city as old as Boston lay centuries of buried chaos. Forgotten tunnels, ancient water and gas pipes, subway lines, the debris of 300 years of construction, all of it in the way, much of it not even accurately mapped. Every foot they dug forward, they risked hitting something nobody knew was there. To keep the ground from collapsing and the buildings above from sinking, engineers had to invent extraordinary techniques, freezing the very earth solid in places just to tunnel through it safely. And the project did produce genuine marvels along the way. To carry the traffic across the Charles River, engineers built a spectacular cable-stayed bridge that became an instant icon of the city's skyline, though even that went through dozens of redesigns before they settled on it. They threaded tunnels beneath a subway line that had to keep running, beneath the harbour itself, beneath the foundations of skyscrapers. In some spots, where the earth was too soft and wet to dig safely, they pumped it full of freezing brine to turn the very ground to solid ice, and then carved through the frozen block. It was audacious. It was, in places, brilliant. This was genuinely some of the most difficult urban engineering ever attempted anywhere in the world. And difficulty in construction has a very direct translation. It translates into time. And time, above all else, translates into money. And this is where the story stops being about a clever tunnel and starts being about a bill that would not stop growing. Because once you are committed, once the holes are dug and the city is torn open and there is no possible way to simply stop halfway.
Even where between Mississauga and Scarborough it would ultimately run. There aren't a lot of comparisons, but let's look at a small segment. It cost $116 million.
Every single problem becomes something you have no choice but to pay to solve. And on a project this size, running this long, through ground this complicated, the problems came without end. Designs had to be changed midway. The scope kept expanding. Inflation gnawed away over the years and years of construction. Every delay meant more months of paying an army of workers and engineers and machines. Let's track how the number actually moved, because it is staggering. It began, remember, at around $2.5 billion. As the work dragged on and the difficulties multiplied, that estimate climbed and climbed, past $5 billion, past $10 billion. By the time the major construction was finally finished, the cost of building it had reached nearly $15 billion. But here is the part that most people miss, and it is the cruelest twist of all. Because the state could not simply pull $15 billion out of its pocket, it had to borrow enormous sums to pay for the project, and borrowed money comes with interest. Year after year, that interest piles up. When you add the interest on all that debt to the cost of the concrete and the steel, the true total the public will have paid by the time the last bond is settled climbs to around $24 billion. Say it slowly. That's 10 zeros. And someone signed off on every single one. And there was a bitter twist in how that debt came to rest so heavily on local shoulders. Early on, the plan had counted on the federal government to cover the lion's share of the cost. The great majority of the bill was supposed to come from Washington. But as the price spiraled ever upward, that federal support was capped. There was a limit to how much the rest of the country was willing to pour into one city's tunnel. And so, as the overruns kept mounting past that ceiling, more and more of the burden fell back onto the state and its drivers, onto local taxes and highway tolls. The people of the region were left holding a bill far larger than they had ever been told they would carry. And that debt is not some distant memory. It is a bill the region is still paying to this day, draining hundreds of millions of dollars every single year. Money that cannot be spent on other roads, other bridges, other trains, because it is still going to pay off a highway that was finished long ago.
To me, that's always been a bit of a disconnect. Like, wait, how could this thing that we hated so much be this thing that we almost can't imagine our city without?
The Big Dig did not just cost a fortune. It reached into the future and quietly taxed it. By now, you might be wondering the same thing people asked at the time. As the cost doubled, then tripled, then climbed past 10 billion, why did nobody simply pull the plug? And the answer is the trap at the center of every story like this one. You cannot abandon a tunnel half dug beneath a living city. Once the old highway is coming down and the ground is torn open and billions are already sunk into the earth, stopping is not an option. You would be left with a catastrophe far worse than finishing. The project had passed the point of no return almost as soon as it began. Every overrun simply had to be paid, because the only thing more expensive than finishing the Big Dig would have been not finishing it. But even the money was not the darkest part of this story, because the relentless pressure to finish and the corners that were cut along the way had consequences far worse than an overrun. And this is where the Big Dig stopped being a punchline and became a tragedy. The warning signs had been there for years, if anyone had truly wanted to see them. Almost as soon as the tunnels opened, they began to leak. In 2004, water came pouring through a wall of one of the brand new downtown tunnels, traced back to debris that had been left in the concrete during construction. Investigators eventually found thousands of leaks. It was a sign, written in water, that the quality of the work in places was not what it should have been. There were even criminal cases over the concrete itself, with suppliers accused of providing substandard material and faking the records to cover it. Think about what that means on a project like this. The concrete is not decoration. It is the very thing holding back the water, the earth, and the weight of a city overhead. When the records that vouch for its quality are faked, you are no longer just over budget. You are building a tunnel that millions of people will drive through on a foundation of paperwork that cannot be trusted. The corners were not being cut at the edges. They were being cut at the core. But the leaks, as alarming as they were survivable. What happened in the summer of 2006 was not.
7.5 miles of roads and tunnels. The old elevated Interstate 93 disappears. A new I-90 route reaches Logan Airport below streets, rail lines, and water.
In one of the tunnels leading toward the airport, the ceiling was held up by heavy concrete panels, each one weighing many tons, suspended from the roof above by bolts, which were themselves held in place by a special adhesive glue. It sounds obscure, but hold on to it, because this small detail is where the whole disaster becomes real. Years earlier, during testing, some of those bolts had shown signs of slipping. It was a warning, it was noted, and the opportunity to act on it, to test further, to fix it properly, was let go. Over time, under the constant, crushing weight of those panels, the glue holding the bolts began to slowly give way. A slow, invisible failure, creeping along above the heads of everyone who drove through, day after day, with no idea it was happening. And then, one night in July of 2006, it failed completely. A section of that heavy concrete ceiling tore loose and crashed down onto the roadway below, onto a car passing through the tunnel at that exact moment. A woman named Milena Del Valle, a passenger in that car, was killed. She was 39 years old, on her way to the airport with her husband. That is the true cost of the Big Dig. Not a figure on a spreadsheet, but a person who went into a tunnel that a great city had spent billions of dollars to build and did not come out. A warning that had been seen and set aside. The investigations that followed traced the collapse to that failed adhesive, and the companies responsible for the design and construction eventually paid hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements. But no settlement could undo what the corner cutting had ultimately cost. So how did this happen? How did a brilliant idea become a decade late, 10 times over, and ultimately deadly ordeal? The answer is the anatomy of almost every megaproject disaster, laid out in one story. It starts with an estimate that is, frankly, too optimistic to be honest, a low number designed to win approval, because the true cost, told up front, might have killed the project before it began. Then reality arrives. The ground is harder, the city is more complicated, the work is slower than anyone admitted, the costs climb. But by now the project is half built and cannot be abandoned.
But one of the biggest highway tunnel projects in modern times is the Big Dig in Boston, a 7.5-mile segment of I-93 buried.
So the money keeps flowing, whatever it takes. And under the mounting pressure of the overruns and the delays, the temptation to cut a corner, to accept the cheaper concrete, to wave through the warning sign and keep moving, grows and grows, until one of those shortcuts, one day, comes crashing down. And here is the most uncomfortable truth of the Big Dig. In the end, it mostly worked. The ugly highway is gone. The tunnels carry the traffic. Where the old road once cast its shadow, there is now a ribbon of parks running through the city. By many measures, Boston got the thing it dreamed of, but it paid something close to 10 times what it was promised, saddled future generations with the debt, and paid a price in a human life that no amount of money can ever justify. That is the quiet lesson buried under Boston. A project can be a success and a disaster at the very same time. Getting there matters as much as arriving. And when the people in charge tell you the price and promise you the date, the honest answer on the grandest projects is almost always the same. It will cost more, it will take longer, and the corners you cut to save a little will be the ones that cost you the most. No sides, no politics, just the receipts. Count the zeros.